So I'd like to welcome our panelists to another wonderful full house at the forum. So today we're trying to have a discussion around the impact that venture capital can have in emerging economies. And I think the thing about venture capital and technology is it requires government to work with technologies and to work with companies, and ultimately just affecting people. And so I wanted to touch on all of those points and really try and speak to some of the skills and experiences that our panelists have in some of these areas. And so I think with government as one of the first, I think Israel's a great example of an ecosystem that has created itself and really become one of the leading forces in technology. And so perhaps a perspective on how that happened would be great.
Yeah, so Israel basically was created with innovation. The first step was the foundation in 1948. And innovation was all around agriculture, water, and energy. Second stage was building our defense industry, again with a lot of innovation. And Israel was built by socialists that came from Europe. And in 1984, our economy was collapsing, 440% inflation rate. And the third stage of innovation came about, which was to turn our economy into export and innovation economy. So the first thing we did is we started to innovate for the world, not for ourselves. We don't have a market, we don't have a region, we don't have natural resources. And the government was very active by doing two things. One is inviting global enterprises to set up a shop in Israel. Nobody came for the market, but all of them came for the innovation. Today we have 350 global enterprises very active in Israel. They gave the Israeli entrepreneurs the first opportunity to innovate. And today in Israel we have 6,000 startup companies that are getting funded at a stage, from early stage to growth, total of about $6 billion every year. And with the help of internet, we opened up the borders and we started to grow enterprises for growth and not for sale. The Israeli government is extremely active in doing that initially by giving incentives to global enterprises to come to Israel, and secondly with the Chief Scientist Office to provide incentive for innovation and created the right climate, and also embarked on a program to launch the venture capital community in the early 90s. Without that, I'm not sure that we would have such a vibrant economy as we have today.
I see. And the other role that government has is to be an investor. And the European Bank of Reconstruction and Development is actually not all that European. It's quite a global cadre of governments. What do you think, Bakhrom, that the role of governments plays as investors?
Well, we focus on emerging markets of Eastern Europe, Turkey, and Northern Africa, right? And what we try to do, we try to provide this venture capital. We try to develop this venture capital asset class, which is very mature in those geographies. And there are a number of ways how you can do it. You know, you can invest in the funds that operate there, but you can also invest directly, and that's what we do. We kind of, you know, the effort that I represent, we invest directly into companies, technology companies, in those geographies, and we look for companies that address global market, which are very scalable. And in a lot of deals, we invest with other venture capital funds, be it local funds and or global. In a lot of times, US-based VC funds. And our kind of key focus is, the way how I see it, right, is the key focus is really nurture the entrepreneur type of support, right? Because I think what a lot of times happens in those emerging markets, right, that there isn't really established venture capital asset class, right? And one very important kind of, it is really the kind of the very important ingredient for the venture to work. It has to be all about entrepreneurs. And a lot of the local funds kind of still learning that kind of focus, and that's what we're trying. That's what we try to bring, is actually finding great entrepreneurs and actually trying to help them in ways that we can besides capital. And really, we try to position us as the service provider to entrepreneurs, as opposed to what is traditionally private equity driven, more developed asset class in those geographies.
I see. And another specific example, Felix, from your experience, you've been somewhat instrumental in the growth of the venture ecosystem here in Portugal. Over the last 5 years, what do you think the government's role in helping Portugal become what it is? Because we can't take all the credit here at Web Summit.
You can try.
What would you say to that? Some of their programs, some of their thoughts, because very often people get bogged down by political processes.
Yeah, it's interesting because I'm basically wearing 3 hats here, because before I came to Portugal, I was an entrepreneur and an investor in Berlin, and ironically, in some way, Berlin, even though it's the capital of the largest economy in Europe, in some ways, after the wall came down, was a bit of an emerging economy, because I think a lot of people have heard the phrase by the mayor of Berlin, "Poor but sexy," because when the wall came down, everybody thought, or at least the government in Berlin thought, okay, now Lufthansa's going to come back, Siemens going to come back, they're just going to come back. Turns out not a single DAX 50 company, or even DAX 100, I think, is based in Berlin these days. So they really had to sort of get scrappy. And it turns out that the whole sort of cultural scene, the energy of Berlin, was very interesting to entrepreneurs. For a long time, there was no master plan by the government, and it just kind of happened. Well, now it is now the capital of startups in Germany, and now with Samsung Next, the fund that I run now in Europe, we chose Berlin also as as our headquarter. So that has, even in a in a sort of very developed economy, that was something that worked out really well for Berlin, to sort of get different profile and get entrepreneurs to move there and basically build out their own economy from scratch. Now, of course, when I moved here, the people in Lisbon were very curious. What was the formula in Berlin? I guess the answer is that you can't really replicate formula. Every ecosystem is a bit different. At the core of it are always entrepreneurs and people that want to do great things. In Berlin, and also I think Lisbon has this going for it. It was very, it's places people want to live and people want to move to. So it's very, sort of attractive to build something here. But at the same time, I think the government has done a good job here in sort of looking what works elsewhere and replicating this and repurposing some of the EU money with the 200M plan and the angel matching programs. And I mean, I don't know if a lot of people outside of the VC community or outside of Europe know that the EIF, the European Investment Fund, is responsible for 42% of all fund contributions in Europe. So that's massive, right? People think of VC as a purely sort of private industry, but especially in Europe, the EIF plays a large role. And I think they did a good job here in Portugal to sort of make sure that ends up in the right hands. And that was very instrumental for sort of a change in mentality here, because Portugal was, as we know, hit very hard by the financial crisis. And I think that really the entrepreneurs and what's going on here with the startup scene now have infected other sectors of Portugal. Portugal always had great products, but exported then the olive oil to Italy for it to be relabeled as Italian olive oil, or has great wine, but it's sort of undervalued in a way. And I think now that the technology is also sort of finding its way into these sectors, and it's become a very entrepreneurial country, which maybe it had been before, but I think now it's been sort of reactivated, and venture capital has played a good role in there, and the government, I think, has done a good job. Yeah.
Indeed. The famous trading economy roars again. And when we think about government that has a role. Technology also has a role. And we think of technology and venture capital today as a somewhat elastic thing, right? It can stretch from inventing a new type of chipset to delivering your groceries, which is really just a labor marketplace. You know, you mentioned the formation of Israel. It was really just a lot of desert, right? And rather than the deep universities and history in the United States, where a lot of the technology innovation comes from, you know, Israel created a lot of hard technology innovation. Kemi, do you want to speak a little bit about how that was created and maybe how others could learn from that?
Yeah, I think we need to open up the discussion and maybe talk a little bit about the broad picture and then try to understand what kind of a role the governments play, the venture plays, etc. So we are living at a time where there is a transition from territories to science and technology. The old world, governments used to build army and military in order to confiscate land, natural resources, and get cheap labor. That's the old world. The new world, the source of greatness, comes from innovation, from technology. So if a country lacks energy, it can create energy. If you lack water, you can desalinate water, you can reuse water. You don't need slaves anymore because everything is automated and it's going to be used by robotics. So there's no reason anymore to stay in the old world. We need to move to the new world. Now, how do we move to the new world? First, governments need to figure out that greatness will become from technology, so they need to focus on science and technology. Even if they have oil and other natural resources, it is not sustainable as a business model. Second thing, VCs are the ones who are investing in companies that are growing very fast and that are not innovating for their own specific local need. The greatest companies in the world are global companies. And in every country, the biggest companies in their economy are going to be technology companies. Even today, you can see in the US, out of the 10 largest companies in the US, 7 of them are technology companies. Starts with Apple, it goes to Alphabet and continues with Amazon and all the others. They pushed away oil and gas and construction and chemicals and finance. They are pushed away and technology is becoming dominant. Even in Israel, the biggest company today is Checkpoint, which is a software company. So that is the trend. Now, if you really want to foster your country, you need to have all those players come together. The government needs to create the right climate for investors, the right climate for entrepreneurship, and the right climate for global enterprises to come on board. The VCs need to invest at the end of the day in companies that are innovating for the world, not for a specific country. And this is exactly the story of Israel. We don't have natural resources, so we understood immediately that greatness will come from innovation. So we had a participation of the government, the global enterprises, and the venture funds. Now, venture funds will not go to a developing area if there are no great entrepreneurs doing things for the world. They need to be first the government, then the global enterprises. And then once you start to find entrepreneurs who are building products for the world, the venture capital funds will come there. When I started investing in Israel 25 years ago, I had friends in Silicon Valley who told me, we will never invest in Israel because, you know, the greatest areas of innovation is Silicon Valley. Today, people innovate all over the world.
And so that leads to a little bit of an issue we've talked a lot about here at Web Summit this week, is you have such a lead in some of these technologies from developed markets.
Yeah.
And that then affects both the ability to innovate as well as inequality, as well as being quasi-governmental, and the nation state's role is somewhat lessened. So how do you think we can help encourage more innovation in that, more local innovation, or do you think it's not possible?
I think it's a must. I think what we see today is actually the last 20 years we've been building an internet for human beings. We took everything that we can move from a physical world to the digital world, and we started share those assets and those resources. We started to collaborate. Now we're building a bigger network of things. We're putting the two of them together through AI and machine learning. And very soon we'll have a new world of services and business models, and the world will take another step forward. Now, lots of people today around the world are left behind. They are not catching up in what's happening. And as a result, what we are seeing, we are seeing a major impact on the political system of leaders in different countries to slow down, to close their borders, to focus on them first. Well, this is not sustainable. What we need to do is we need to continue and think beyond borders. We need to address the young generation. We need to teach them how to innovate. Not all of them will be scientists. Not all of them will be AI specialists. But everyone can be entrepreneurial and innovator. But in any case, we need to teach the young generation how to move forward so we don't have to slow down. And unfortunately, now we're living in that time of transition from territories to science and technology. Lots of people are left behind. And as a result, the political system is disintegrating itself. So the European Union is not moving in as according to the initial plan after World War II. What's happening in the US is very clear. So we need to find a way how to bring more and more people to the innovation game, because this is the source of power, of greatness. That's the future.
And Felix, you are with a large global corporation which does lots of R&D in Asia, and your job here is essentially to come and find the local technologies that will, impact that company. Do you think Samsung's looking to just grow their population of customers? Or are they trying to find novel technologies as they, invest across different places?
Right. I mean, Samsung is very good at hardware, and is doing really well. But what Samsung Next, what we do specifically is we're helping Samsung with the transition to a world where most of the value is derived from software. So that's why Samsung is investing there aggressively. And like Shemi said, it's good. Innovation happens everywhere these days, right? So you got to look everywhere. It's not just our group initially started out in Silicon Valley because that was sort of the obvious place to look, and also, of course, there was this idea of understanding Silicon Valley culture, understanding innovation culture, and then the next stop for Samsung Next, also not surprisingly, was Israel, and now we're in Europe, and Europe, of course, is very interesting. In first because it's very fragmented. It ranges from, emerging and developing economies all the way to very highly developed ecosystems, obviously, and highly financialized ecosystems like London. But what is happening, I think, is as the low-hanging fruits of the first 20 years of internet have been picked, now a lot of traditional industries are being digitized, right? First we moved the obvious things onto the internet, music, journalism, everything that could be very easily represented by bits. Now it gets a bit messier and more capital intensive, and you can't necessarily do it with 3 people in the garage. But it's also a great chance for industries that are leading in their sectors now in different areas, and Europe has these areas, whether it's luxury industry, hospitality. Then of course also if you look at Germany, mobility and automation, we're still leading in these areas, and I don't buy this narrative that Tesla is gonna be for Mercedes what Apple was to Nokia. I think those players have understood that software will drive the value of their products, and they're moving aggressively into it. So I think that's very interesting and a real chance for Europe also, where I'm not going to say the pendulum is swinging back to Europe, but it's a great chance to sort of, if we've kind of slept through the first half of the football game, Now the second half is only starting, and it's getting more complicated, right? It's getting more digitization of the real world, and of anything that has sort of a logistical component, has a real world component, has sensors in it. Is a bit trickier, and that's why I think we eventually now with Samsung Next start to look here and start to invest here, because we see a lot of really great innovation happening in also more mature ecosystems like France. I mean, it's amazing what's happening in Paris. They kind of slept through it for a while, and now I think, given that there is great engineering talent here, where I think we woke up in Europe a bit later to it than maybe in Israel, where it was much more systematic, much early on, where it was understood. We are a small market, we have no natural resources, we got to move aggressively into this. Of course, in Europe it's much more fragmented, but I think especially in smaller economies like here, that message has now sunk in, and I think all the players are sort of working in the same direction to catch up.
Well, Felix, I hope you haven't offended too many people by saying all the German and French technologists were asleep.
They were, no, not anymore.
But it raises a good point where, you mentioned the EIF, 14 billion of investment across venture capital to support that industry in Europe, quasi-governmental organization. What I think is a good question is, from an EBRD perspective, right? How do you ask the question to yourselves, am I subsidizing something that otherwise shouldn't be invested in? Maybe it's done better somewhere else, maybe innovated better in America or another geography. Do you weigh that up? And, how do you measure the risk and the reward there?
No, the short answer, we don't. And before joining EBRD and before starting this venture capital, direct venture capital effort EBRD, I was with two other VC funds investing across Western Europe and the US. And in practice, I do not see philosophically much of the difference. What we do, we look for great entrepreneurs, and we look for great entrepreneurs addressing large markets. And we invest across a lot of the different countries. A lot of the different countries, kind of Eastern Europe, Turkey, Northern Africa. Each of them are different. Each of the local market is different, have different dynamics. But one thing is true, and the more I spend, I've been doing now this for 5 years, the more I spend time, the more I see that, and I truly believe in that, is that great companies come from everywhere. Great companies come from everywhere, and in today's world, it's much cheaper to start a company. Today's world, the definition of the product is actually not just the product itself, but it's also how you package it, how you distribute it, what is the sales channels, what are the customer services. This is all part of the product definition, and you can do it based anywhere. And that's what we see today, that we see that there are great companies in many different countries, right? And they address global market. And these are the entrepreneurs that we want to find, and these are the entrepreneurs that we want to back, to help them, right? To help them to grow to the next stage. This is what we focus on, and maybe compared to investing in the U.S. or if you were to kind of compare that, investing in U.S. or Western Europe in those emerging markets, I think the risk is always the same, right? In venture capital, the risk is whatever you say, kind of, be it Uber, be it any kind of great unicorn, right, or any other company, the risk is always the same. The risk is always that you will lose all what you invested, right? So, and the beauty about the venture capital, that while that risk exists, that
it's okay to lose it.
To lose your invested capital, is the upside is not limited. So, and that's really the focus is. The focus is not about the risk side, but the focus is all about the upside. And most of the time, when we cannot proceed on the investment, it's not that the investment is very risky, is that we don't see enough upside, right? And that's what we want to see. We want to find more and more companies. We want to see more entrepreneurs who are really going after global opportunities. And in my kind of, if we were to talk about the kind of the kind of development of the venture capital, development of the entrepreneurship, my kind of more kind of practical view is that the most important for the development of the technology sector or technology ecosystem is not about the kind of government investing or government regulation, but in my kind of pragmatic experience, the most important, we need to have more success cases, success stories, right? When you have in a certain country, right, when you have small country, when you have a big company coming out at the global scale, creating impact on the global scale, you have other entrepreneurs on the ground saying, okay, he or she has been able to do that. There is no reason why I cannot do that. And I think this is kind of, the more you see that, the more we'll see really great companies coming out of those countries.
Yeah, I agree.
One thing, can I add one thing to it? I think one of the dangers that I've seen, or that are sometimes apparent, is that, you know, when VC funds raise their money, a lot of times it comes with restrictions, right? So if governments get involved, what you see sometimes, especially in Europe, is that money comes with too many restrictions. So that necessarily, I mean, usually the VC works really well because the incentive structure is very aligned between the entrepreneur and the investor. And if a government is smart and just comes in, you know, as an investor in the best funds, and just sort of as a co-investor, that can work really well because it gets an ecosystem going. What happens sometimes though is that money is too restricted, and that, you know, local funds can only invest locally, and then you start deploying money into companies that are maybe you wouldn't have made it in a more open market, because all of a sudden you have a fund that's government backed, that is EU money in it or government money in it, that needs to deploy 100% of their capital in a very small emerging market, and then you start funding, you know, the wrong companies and keeping companies alive for too long, and that slows an ecosystem development down, because we're all, I mean, our business is about failing fast, and, you know, and you only have so many companies in you, so it's better if an entrepreneur runs out of money faster and does another company, and then another company, and then maybe with his third company he will succeed. But sometimes in these emerging ecosystems you see companies being sort of extended a lifeline again and again and again, because those funds cannot invest in the best companies anywhere, but they have to invest it with, you know, heavy restrictions for certain industries or certain areas. That might work for a very large market like France or Germany, but you know, in smaller emerging markets and in Europe it doesn't work. The EIF does this. They do not a bad job. They don't have the biggest restrictions, but sometimes then the local money from the local banks is restricted with is distributed with too many restrictions, or the government starts investing themselves and, you know, basically picking out the companies themselves, and that's also a model that has proven not to work really well. So I think Israel was smart in that. I mean, you would know more about it than I, but I think they were smart in really collaborating with the private sector, with the VCs, and just sort of deploying that as a fund of funds.
Yeah. On that point, our focus is actually what is the definition of whether actually company is the kind of emerging markets company or not for us. For us, it is only one definition, where development is sitting, right? Physically, where the development is. So if the physical development is one of the countries that we operate, we would consider that, right? We're actually not looking where the company is incorporated. Yeah. We're not looking at where the kind of management and sales are. What we're looking for the great, you know, if you look at Eastern Europe specifically, right, the competitive advantage, and it is a competitive advantage, and it is twofold, and there is a positive and negative about this. The competitive advantage that there is a very deep technical talent, one side of the coin, and another side of the coin, high unemployment. There's no McKinsey, there's no Goldman Sachs, right? There is a high unemployment, and if the market is small, if you're good, you know, if you're good and you believe in yourself, what you do, you create your own business. Yeah. And that's a competitive advantage.
And it's, so we touched on some interesting points there where, you know, you can start a company anywhere in the world, and that the beauty of venture capital is that the upside is unlimited. I tend to describe the job of a venture capitalist as you get to spend time with people that are smarter than you, and then you get to take bets on them every now and again. When we were talking earlier, Kemi defined it somewhat better, I think, where he said you got to get cutting edge technology, you got to find a way that it grows really quickly, and you got to have it affect a massive population. And I think it's a very succinct way of looking at what the venture capital asset class is versus what sometimes it's been stretched to do nowadays.
Yeah.
And so, as we wrap up, I'd love to think, as you, through your experience, what would you think are the companies you've worked with or seen in an emerging ecosystem that are good examples of that?
Yeah, so first of all, in Israel, what we are trying to do is we're trying to expand the group of people that we're investing with. They are part of our society that are not participant in the game of Startup Nation. One of them is the Israeli Arabs. What we're trying to do with them is find innovation for the Middle East region with the concept of there is an English-speaking internet market and there is a Chinese internet-speaking market. Both are separate, language-based, that created very big companies with analogies. There's Baidu and Google, there's WeChat and there's Facebook, etc., etc. So we're trying to define the Arabic internet-speaking market, the Arabic-speaking internet market, 400 million people, 22 countries. But then when you invest in a startup like that, you need to make sure that there is a real market out there that is supported by local GDPs that allow for the flow of advertisement dollars and spend, etc. And there is a mindset to take things global. So that's one thing that we are trying to do. Now we are also active in Eastern Europe. We're trying to see again that when we invest in those entrepreneurs, they don't think about their own local environment. The biggest mistake in the world, in my view, was done in France, where the first online business, the Minitel, was invented. But the French never thought about taking it globally, so nobody came to France to try and globalize it. And at the end of the day, the internet was born in the US and not in France. So today in Israel, we're trying to really innovate for the world. And this is a message that has to go to any other society that wants to become sort of an entrepreneurial society. You have to innovate for the world. You have to innovate for the masses. And you need to do it in a way that allow you to grow very, very fast. Leverage the internet, leverage automation, leverage the ability of talent to pull together. Yes, you can innovate everywhere in the world, but you cannot innovate in the same places. Still, there are places that are fostering innovation more than other places. So find your way how to build a really significant company. Otherwise, not sure it's worthwhile to start.
Thank you very much. So yeah, I think that's a nice way to end, in that once you just build a really significant company, that's what matters the most. And I think that really ties together the venture capital community in the developed world, the emerging world, and elsewhere. I'd like to thank everybody for joining us today, and enjoy the rest of the conference.
Thank you.
Thank you.